Welcome to InflexionPoint Podcast, where we cultivate change from the inside out as we ponder the Cairo question. Will Cairo have to protest in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? We stand on the belief that dismantling racism goes beyond laws and legislation or politics and economics. Here, anti-racism activation is presented as an inside job where personal transformation and accountability impact social change. So take a seat at the anti-racism activation table with InflexionPoint Podcast.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the newest episode of InflexionPoint Podcast. We are dedicated to the art of listening in authentic conversation. We challenge our audience to listen actively and intentionally for the purpose of critical self-reflection, in-depth perspective taking, personal transformation, and ultimately social impact. Our 2024 theme has focused on the art of community conversations, and particularly in today's climate of systemic and institutional racism, anti-racism activation, equity, diversity, inclusion, and book banning. So I am your host, Anita Russell, and here is a quick hello from co-hosts Mavis and Gail.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Mavis Bauman.
Hi, I'm Gail Hunter, and welcome tonight.
Thank you. So in this episode, we explore the topics of resilience, resistance, and accountability in relation to societal racism. So back in February, as part of his bid to become an independent nominee for president, RFK Jr. decided that he wanted to have a discussion on the topic of resilience and racism with an audience of Black people. And so what was interesting about the article is that his approach to talking about resilience as it relates to racism, societal racism, institutional racism, and all of that. So we wanted to dedicate this episode to exploring those topics, beginning with this particular statement, these comments that were made by Robert Kennedy Jr., and all of that. And so what we will also be pointing out is a counter argument to that, which is an article that came from the News One, which sees his comments in a very, very different lens. And they look at it through the lens of a 70-year-old white man, essentially white-splaining to Black people that education is the key to making Black people immune from racism. So we're going to dig into this topic very deeply, and starting off just talking about this idea of societal racism, which is defined as a type of racism that's based on structural, institutional, historical, cultural, and interpersonal practices within a society, right? Particularly as it relates to us in America, a society that places one or more social or ethnic groups in a better position to succeed and disadvantages other groups so that disparities develop between these groups. So Mavis and Gail, when you hear this definition of societal racism, what are some of the things that are kind of popping into your mind? I mean, we've talked about this so many times, but just kind of looking at it now through the lens of racism, looking at societal racism now through the lens of resistance and resilience in particular. So just give me some of your beginning thoughts about what that looks and feels like.
I'll go ahead.
Go ahead.
Gail gave me the nod. The first thing that comes to mind is it's as if the burden of racism is being placed on the victim. Mm-hmm. To say that Black folks are not resistant or resilient enough is to turn the whole subject upside down, because it is certainly resilience, and all of us can give us an advantage in working in this world. but to expect to force to put forth resilience as a solution to what lives are like for Black folks is just backwards to me. It should be more about the education of white people so that they are not doing the things that Black people have to shrug off and be resilient to. The epithets, the job, lack of access, all of those things that are so systemic, that resilience in each individual is not going to solve racism. That's what comes to my mind.
I mean, if we reverse this and it was the white people that had been, was racist against white people and all the decades and centuries that's been going on since the 1700s, when, by the way, there are a few white men that got together and decided that Black people were inferior to white people based on the fact that they needed to justify why they were using Black people for socioeconomic reasons and getting free labor. So if we reverse that, I can assure you that white people would not be agreeing with this, right? And because Black people have always been resilient, they've had to be resilient from all the trauma that they've gone through in their lives and generationally. They have had to learn resiliency. They've also had to learn how to teach their children how to protect themselves living in a world where people were prejudiced against them, and they were going to be doing things to them, saying things to them that were not accurate, but they were going to be inappropriate, and they're going to be hurtful and abusive. So for any white person to say it's you that has to do this work, it's time to look in that mirror, folks. And as a white person, we have to do that. We have to be willing to look inside ourselves and say, what part of me is believing that? What part of me is saying that I need to look at the Black person next to me, that they need to do something to change? The change is not within them. The change is within ourselves as a culture, as a white culture.
Absolutely. I agree.
Absolutely. So let's dig a little bit deeper into some of the things that Robert Kennedy Jr. actually was saying. And he was describing how education will make us immune to racism like the Avengers. So I have problems with that opening statement just on so many levels. First of all, education has never been the answer to racism, right? Because if you think about historically, you think about the history, for example, how history is taught and all of the fallacies and all of the fables, if you will, and all of the myths and everything that are associated with American history, as opposed to the truth of what our history actually is. So just this idea of saying that education is something that is going to make me as a Black person immune to racism, like the Avengers aren't even real. They're not even real. It's like a cartoon comic character. So just the setup of that is just absolutely ridiculous to me. But I'm going to kind of bear with it and just go in and read some of the things that he was actually saying. He starts off this by saying, we are never going to eliminate racism. Just let that statement sink in. We are never going to eliminate racism. And this is his explanation. We are hardwired from the 20,000 generations that humanity spent wandering the African savanna in little tribal groups. We're hardwired to look for differences in other people and then to essentially practice racism. To me, that kind of describes the whole idea or the basis underlying the idea of white supremacy.
Right.
It's this thing that is, you're essentially saying, I'm hardwired to be racist. I mean, that's my interpretation of that statement.
That's exactly what
I'm hardwired to be racist. So because I'm hardwired to be racist, there's nothing I can do about the fact that I'm racist. So therefore, you have to figure out how you're going to deal with the fact that I'm hardwired to be racist.
And it is not yours to figure out. It is ours as a white person to figure that out. But it is blatantly white supremacy. And that's what that was. That's where that came from, right? Just to justify the abuse of, and the misuse and the taking advantage of, and the horrific conditions that white people put black people in from the time they brought them over and had kidnapped them, basically.
The dehumanization.
The dehumanization, right?
Yeah, you know,
Yeah.
it seems like RFK is kind of pulling this out of the air. Like 20,000 years ago, what does he really know about what was like in Africa? Did they notice the differences in each other because they were able to trade goods? Certain groups had you know, something that the other groups wanted. Is that necessarily racism? Is noticing difference racism?
Right. No.
I don't think so. And I really I would love to speak to him directly and say, don't even say out loud that racism cannot be cured. Because with some education of white people, it
Right.
can be. I believe that with
That's
all
right.
my heart.
But it's not the education of black people. It's really the education of white people that everyone must be willing to look within themselves and to learn, to grow.
Right, absolutely. So he goes on to say, I had a great education. I had a family who loved me. I had role models. My country had confidence in my future. So I could look at that statement right there. I can also say I had a great education. I had a family who loved me, and I had role models in my family. My mother was an activist. She was the role model for me that helped me to understand who I am, to understand my identity, number one, but also to understand the larger picture of the society that I live in and how I'm going to walk through that society. And I do not walk through that society as if I am immune to racism. I am not a superhero. I am a human being. Right? So I hate those things. But then he goes on to say, my country had confidence in my future. Now there's the break right there. Because when you understand the whole idea of how the notion or the myth of Black inferiority progressed, I did not grow up in a country that had a confidence in my future. I grew up in a country where people looked at me within a certain context and only based on the color of my skin, that this is where you belong. This is what you have the potential to do. So those other two things, I had a great family. I had a family who loved me, right? None of that makes me immune to racism because racism is not something that was inherent in my upbringing, in my family. It wasn't connected to whether or not my family loved me. It is connected to the fact that I live in a racialized society.
Yes. Yes.
Right?
And you know, I'm sorry, you got to finish your thought there, Anita.
Yeah, I just want to say, then he goes on to say, those are the types of things referring to, so he, in an earlier part, he talked about how he experienced slurs, not racial slurs, I'm sorry, anti-Catholic slurs because he was Catholic. So you experience these slurs, but then you can also say about you had the great education, you had the family who loved you, you had the role models, you had all of that, you had a country that had confidence in your future. And so the way I see it, dealing with slurs, somebody calling me a name is the least of my problems.
Right.
It's the least of my experience in living in a racialized society.
Well, and the other reality is that people that were anti-Catholic, they evolved over decades and decades, right? And there may still be some, but you don't hear about it. You know, you don't see it or hear about it as you would have maybe 50 to 80, 100 years ago. That hasn't changed for Black people, right? It hasn't evolved like that. So to even use that as an analogy is not even appropriate. Right?
No, totally a false equivalent. I hate that when, you know, there's this tendency to equate. But are you saying, Gail, that the attitudes toward Catholicism have changed over the years?
Over the decades, I think they've changed.
Over the decades.
Yeah, when my parents were, they were born in the 1911 and 13, let's say, and my aunt, my mother's sister, married someone that was Catholic. At that time, she was fairly ostracized from her family for a period of time. And then gradually over time, I think that there was a generalized awareness or understanding or moving beyond that we haven't really seen happening with racism.
Right. It happened in my family too. So in one generation,
Yeah.
the Catholic person was embraced and it wasn't talked
Right,
about.
exactly.
These things are possible.
Yes.
These things are possible. But
But
again,
it wasn't the Catholics that changed it. It were the people that had the negative sort of belief system against Catholics.
yeah. And then, again, about the false equivalent, the whole idea of racism and the history of racism and how Black folks have been treated since they became to this country is so deep and so broad that, to say a slur to a Catholic person is equal to a slur to a Black person is just not accurate.
No, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
I want to say, you can make kids resilient. Now, this is the part that really, really gets under my skin. You can make kids resilient against racism with good education and Black business role models. And then the racism will bounce off the Black children like they were the Avengers. Again, like we are supposed to be these superheroes. And we're supposed to be able to just take on this, so all the societal things related to racism, and that's supposed to be the thing that gets us through life, right?
it changes racism, and that's not going to change racism. Might
and
change.
not only that, but the idea of good education, like what does that look like? I mean, there were times when it was against the law for me to even be educated.
I learned to read, let alone
To read, right? All of that. It was against the law for me to be educated. Or when you think about segregated school systems, like where is this good education coming from? I grew up in this era of segregated school systems. So where is this coming from?
Right.
I remember the Walk 9. That's real. So this whole idea that education is the answer, education has not been the answer when you're dealing with racism. It has never been the answer.
Well, and look at Tulsa, Oklahoma. What happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
They had this thriving, successful Black community. And what did white people do to them? Killed them, burned the whole thing down, destroyed it. Yeah.
Buried the story even.
Yes.
Then the idea of, my child can only develop this so-called resilience by being educated and having Black business role models. Right there, you're again, to your point, Mavis, you're putting the onus on me.
That's right.
You're putting the onus on me. Or it's kind of like if I am, because we've heard this kind of analogy before, if I'm the victim of a rape.
Dress differently.
Yeah, I have to.
It's the same thing, right? It's the woman.
Yeah, exactly.
Falls on me. What did I do to perpetrate this person? Or
Nothing.
What did I do? I was literally walking down the street, minding my own business, and all of a sudden I'm in this situation.
Right. It's the same thing. It's similar anyways. Yeah.
It's that same very lack of accountability type of mindset. I didn't create my rape. I didn't create racism, but yet everything gets piled up on top of me, like I, as the victim, and I'm the one who brought it on myself. So
you
now
must solve it.
I have to teach my 4-year-old grandson that he's got to be a superhero to deal with racism.
No.
It's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Did you want to read anything more from him, or I'm going to comment on his comments?
Well, this is the last thing that I will say.
Okay.
I would definitely like you to chime in. The way you do that is by giving them a great education so that they know they have potential. Your schools have designed to tell me that I don't have potential. Your schools have been designed to tell me that I am inferior to you. So how in the world can I look at you as being the one who is going to tell me how I can educate my Black child to be resilient to racism? The other thing is to give them business models. I've had business models. We have business models. We have role models. We have teachers. We have this, and opportunities within their known neighborhood. I had that growing up. It did not make racism seem any less to me because I had those things growing up. Mavis?
What I was thinking about when I first heard his comments is that I really am not comfortable tearing down someone I don't know, I wasn't there. Let's just put that up front. I want to give him a little bit of grace as a human being, but what was printed in the newspapers tell me he has never spent any time looking in himself and learning deeply where his thoughts come from or just what it is like for a Black person. He was speaking to a Black group when he made these comments, right?
Yes.
I mean, I can't imagine how they responded, but it made him, to me, and I'm still very early on this learning process, it made him look ignorant. You know, he just is not informed. And, you know, that room should have been full of white people and him saying, look, we can change this. Let's do this. Let's, you know, racism, come on, let's do this. Let's get rid of it. Instead, he's asking Black people to behave differently. That's just crazy.
Yeah.
Well, that is the problem. I mean, that is always that he comes from a place of white supremacy that believes, from what he's saying, anyways, that would appear that way. That he's not looked in that mirror at himself. He's not challenged his own mindset to look at this differently. And so he's projecting the blame and the responsibility for his racist behavior. And I'll generalize that to the white population, but to look to the Black people to solve it. And it's not, they have experienced the effects of racism. They did not cause racism, right?
That's pretty clear distinction.
I mean, and so they should not be the ones with the responsibility of changing this because they don't have the power to change what is within white people.
No,
right?
Exactly. That's
Only
really
we do.
key.
Yes.
Yeah. And, you know, remember John F. Kennedy was you know, he was all about changing and listening to people who were screaming for civil rights.
Right.
I wonder what he would think of what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is saying. And where did Robert F. Kennedy Jr. get instilled with this belief system? You know, where did that come from? I mean, the Kennedy family is certainly exposed to all kinds of people from all parts of the world, but not enough, it would appear, to really examine themselves personally and say, what, you know, and they've got the power too, they've got the voice, speak up about it.
Right, exactly.
So there was an article in News One, and there were a few points that this article put in. So this was sort of a counter argument to some of the things that RFK was saying. And the things that were pointed out, RFK grew up white, well off, and in a family full of some of the most well-known and revered elected officials in American history. That's number two. In terms of the anti-Catholic slurs that he says that he experienced, when it comes to the devastating effects of systemic racism on Black people, racial slurs are really the least of it all. Right? And then it further says, white politicians, regardless of party affiliation, all seem to have the same issue when it comes to connecting with the Black collective. inherent condescension. And then finally, Black people already know how important education is, but certainly not as a racism-proof shield. Rather, it highlights how different the American experience, educationally and otherwise, truly is for Black people. It's just not the same. It just isn't the same. And if you want to take a little bit of a slightly different view of all of this, Gail, when we were talking earlier, and we used the example of Indian boarding schools.
That's right. That's right.
Right? And if you look at the history of Indian boarding schools and what that whole thing was about, and I had an article that I pulled up, and this is what they say when you look at it within the context of this resistance, or some of the things that we're talking about here. Boarding schools embody both victimization and agency for Native people, and they serve as sites for cultural loss and cultural persistence. These institutions intended to assimilate Native people into mainstream society and eradicate Native cultures became integral components of American Indian identities and eventually fueled the drive for political and cultural self-determination. So it was meant for one thing in terms of indoctrination, assimilation, and all of that. But it was also victimization, brutalization, taking away culture.
Annihilation of people, yeah.
Right.
Yes, exactly. Annihilating a people. But at the same time, this idea of resilience, it did not apply to that population any more than it applies to our population.
Right.
This is not about something that we have to just develop resilience to, and everything will just be okay.
Well, because then that creates a mask for what really happened and how everything was created when people came to this country. They invaded a country that other people already inhabited. And what they did, they kept pushing them back further and further until they forced them into living on reservation. I mean, it was, you know, enough of the history, we all do.
Right.
That's not that dissimilar to what happened with Black people. It's what we went to another country to get them.
I just wanted to finish out with this one last statement, and then we're going to go to break. So since those years, tribal nations have carried out political activism, which I consider to be resistance, and gained legislation and federal policy that gives them the power to decide how to use federal education funds, how they educate their children, and the authority to establish their own community-based schools. That is resistance.
Right.
It is not just resilience and taking all of this on as if it's just going to bounce off of us and not have any impact on us, whether it's the Native community or the Black community. The idea that resilience is the answer and simply educating people to be resilient is the answer is a lie.
That's right.
It's
insulting.
And abuse was going on in both places.
Exactly.
Some people were killed and some children were killed. Just
Absolutely.
as many Black people were killed. Yeah.
Absolutely. So we're going to take a quick break and then we'll come back and resume the conversation. So welcome back to Inflection Point Podcast and our community conversations for 2024. In today's episode, our topic of discussion is societal racism, resilience, resistance, and accountability. So, Gail, I'd really like you to help us dig deeper into this the second part of the conversation, where resilience and racial socialization, and talk about how resilience is misunderstood when talking about racism.
Right. Well, what is resilience? Resilience is a term that's often used for survivors of trauma, of some type of trauma, right? And so but it is learned through the healing and the work of a trauma survivor, right? And that they can develop resistance, but that doesn't change that fact of what happened to them, the trauma that occurred. And what this sounds more like is like trying to say, well, just don't let's talk about it. Let's not think about that. Let's not even look at that, right? And now it's up to Black people to go on and not resist, but just develop this resiliency. Well, you can't develop that without accessing that core truth of what caused it, right? And so it's not just Black, it's white people have to be willing to do that. We cannot change anything that's based on something that's not true. And each of us that has white colored skin has to take a look within ourselves and look at what are we really expecting Black people to do here, right? We're just wanting them to go on as if they're the Avengers, as if they are going to ignore the reality of what they've lived with moment to moment and day to day in their lives, this generation and past generations. Who would want to do that? Who could do that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
That's not resiliency.
absolutely. So there was an NPR a podcast,
Yeah.
and it was Rachel Martin talking with Parul Sehgal of the New York Times about the use of the word resilience as something to aspire to, and how it's become a coded way to shame people who speak about injustice. That's kind of linked to part of what you were talking about, Gail, that if you're this idea that if you are resilient to something, that means that you're too strong, you're
Right.
that other thing, or recognizing the fact that the reality of what you dealt with also impacted you, right?
Right.
But it's this other way of saying that's not really the issue. Whether or not it impacted you in that way is not the issue. The issue is that you were resilient enough to overcome it.
Right.
Right. And so it goes on to say it's been used to describe. So, for example, they're looking at a student protesting, right? It's been used to describe these students protesting as a kind of distortion, because it sort of equates protesting and objecting to racism as being weak. So if I'm resilient, that means I'm strong. But if I'm objecting to the very thing that traumatized me, that means I'm weak.
Okay, and again, think about a sexual trauma survivor. Would you say that to them?
Mm-hmm.
No, of course not. Well, why would they even begin to think about saying that to someone who's experienced trauma because of racism? And that's what most people have experienced. You wouldn't, would you? You want them to look and own and acknowledge and actualize that the reality of what has happened. You can't develop the resiliency until you've done that, until you've worked through the pain and all the feelings that come with that. Right? Otherwise, you're just masking it.
Absolutely.
You know?
Absolutely.
It's just a mask. And of course, I can understand why white people would want them to put that mask on, because then they don't have to feel the shame, or they don't have to feel the uncomfortableness or the anxiousness of what they have actually carried along with them within themselves, that they have not changed.
Well, and I'm hearing something in the background of these comments that's, well, Black folks, can you please calm down? Because you're the ones who loot and all these things when something goes wrong, and we're kind of scared of you. You know, I just feel like, again, there's a serious racist undertone to what he's saying. He's not RFK. He's not talking about white people doing the work. He wants Black folks to be really quiet.
Right. Seen but not heard.
Quiet, seen but not heard. And you know, it just reminds me of a comment a friend of mine said, that, you know, of course, it's always Black people that commit the crimes. And, you know, that perception is just so wrong.
Well,
And I think that that's what backs up the fear and the inability to, the continued dehumanization of people of color. just, you got it wrong. You just got it wrong. And you're hiding. And you know how you feel yourself if you're willing to acknowledge it. You know that you're part of the problem, basically.
And then we go back to what the opening statement was from Robert Kennedy Jr. is we're never going to eliminate racism. Right there. Right there. It's telling you, look, Black people, racism is not going away.
Right.
So you got to figure out how you're going to deal with it, how you're going to cope with it.
Yeah.
Because we're not doing anything within ourselves.
Right.
Even though we're the perpetrators, we're the creators, we're the founders, we're the everything. When
everything.
It comes to that racist ideology, we're the ones who created that. We invented that. We designed that.
I'm not changing that belief, right?
And I'm not changing
You're
that.
inferior to me.
So you basically have to figure out how to deal with it. That's essentially what he's saying.
That's exactly what he's saying.
Further suggesting the way that I think you should deal with it is just teach your children to be resilient. Teach your children to be like little Avengers. So it hits them and it bounces off. The racism hits them and bounces off.
Well, it's perfect projection of blame.
But that's the exact opposite of resilience, right, Gail?
Right, it's totally opposite of resilience. It's projecting blame, and then it's using gaslighting and on top of it all to mask whose shame is this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Whose shame is this? It's not Black people's shame at all.
Right. I was referring to that Psychology Today article, key points about racial socialization that builds resilience by promoting racial pride, coping skills, and mental well-being. Again, all of the burden is on the victims of racism.
Right.
I mean, and you know, I'm just, I mean, I know, Anita, you could speak to this better, but this is what's happening in Black homes already. You know, got to get an education, be proud of yourself. It just seems so kind of elementary, really.
Well, it's just, it's an excuse.
And I mean, I just look at myself as an example. When I think about how I raised up my own children, there was never a moment in their lives that I made them think, feel, or believe that they were somehow less because of the color of their skin. So I didn't need somebody to tell me how to raise my children up to build that resilience by promoting pride, racial pride in who they are, coping skills, mental well-being. All of those things are things that we automatically do. We didn't need
that's right.
Yes, that's what I'm saying. Exactly.
That since the first day we stepped foot in on these parts of the world.
That's right.
That's nothing new. The ancestors, they taught us that.
Yes.
They carried that. And that has been a part of who we have been all of these years, all of these centuries living in the United States. So don't sit here and try to tell me that you're coming up with this grandiose idea of how we could fix ourselves by being resilient.
Yeah.
We've been doing that.
I mean, who is more resilient than people who have come up from slavery?
That's right.
Exactly.
Survivors of trauma are very resilient. They're survived, and every person that is a person of color has experienced that. You've been doing, as you said, you've been teaching your children for eons of time, right? Of course you've been doing that. But the insult of suggesting that that's what you can do to create resiliency is just absurd and disrespectful. Extremely disrespectful.
About faith, family involvement, cultural pride, all of those things are like a part of how we literally function every day in our communities. So all of that, like to your point, Mavis, you know, those people who are out there who want to be bamboozled into believing that Black people are all criminals, we're all drug addicts, none of us take care of our children, we don't have any education. You go right ahead and keep on believing that. You go right ahead.
That's not going to change.
Because there's no truth to that.
That's right.
There's absolutely no truth to that at all.
And you cannot change anything without the truth being at the base.
Exactly.
Just
Exactly.
love that,
So
Gail. That's so
you're-
true.
Exactly. So you're not believing that we're educated, that we're strong, that we have faith, that we have family. That's your issue. That's
Right.
not my issue.
That's right.
It's not my issue,
No.
right? You
Mhm.
come in the average Black person's homes, we have books about who we are, we have stories about who we are, we have history about who we are. That's a natural part of what occurs in our homes.
That is a history of resiliency, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
And the trauma that caused the need for it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Mhm.
But then we also we talk about that history of resilience, but we also have that history of resistance.
Right.
We have been resisting since day one.
Mhm.
There has never been a time in our history in this country where we just sat down and said, okay, fine, this is
Right.
all there is.
Right.
This is all there is. Never has been and never will be.
Mhm.
Isn't that nice to hear that from a white person? You need to work on your resistance. I mean, it highlights the chasm of understanding, that there's just no real absorption of what it's like for Black folks in this country.
And you shouldn't even it shouldn't be there for you to resist. It shouldn't be there. That's the should. And it doesn't have to be there. And it's a choice in this present time.
What are you referring to now, Gail?
Well, that if all this was, the history was different and had not abuse and trauma in it, and all that happened to Black people, and it had more based in respect and equity and so forth, there wouldn't be a need for resistance, right? But who caused that? It wasn't Black people.
There wouldn't be a need for white people to tell us how to resist.
Exactly, right.
The irony.
Yeah.
Irony.
Exactly.
That's all.
And when it comes to just a little bit about resistance, this is from a Sage publication, Revisiting Resistance. Revisiting Resilience in Light of Racism, Othering, and Resistance. So this article is kind of taking a look at it, not just through the lens of resilience, but also through the lens of racism, othering, and this idea of resistance, right? I mean, I was raised on resistance. I raised my kids on resistance. And what that resistance means for me is knowing who I am in my personhood, in my humanity, and resisting anybody who wants to take that and diminish it and make me smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Because you think I'm inferior. Doesn't matter to me if that's what you think. This is how I live. This is how I function. Right? And then it goes on to say that at present, resilience research is largely located within a Eurocentric epistemology, right? With little insight into social and economic policies that shape and are shaped by resilience and a lack of engagement with anti-racist scholars and activists. You want us to just shut up and go away. But that's not going to happen. And that is a part of the resistance that is there.
And needs to be there.
Absolutely. And it's always been there. It's always been there. Think about the Underground Railroad. Was that not resistance? Think about Nat Turner. Was that not resistance?
Yes.
Think about the Haitian Rebellion. Was that not resistance?
Right.
Resistance has always been there.
Mhm.
And it will continue to always be there.
Until racism doesn't have to be used and exist.
Right.
And it's not Black people that are going to stop and change that. Right?
Yeah. And
It's
then
only
it goes,
gonna be white people.
resistance needs to be viewed as the mediating process of resilience, targeted at challenging the adversity rather than accommodating the adversity.
Yeah.
Mm.
Right?
You know, Anita, I don't know if you plan to talk about this, but I did see a short bit about Black joy. And I remember
Yes.
hearing about that years and years ago.
Yeah.
Could you just comment on Black joy
I love that.
and contrast it to the idea of resilience, or is it the same thing?
No, so I actually have a quote here
Yeah.
from you. It's from an article called Black Joy, Resistance, Resilience, and Reclamation. It was in a publication called Cultural Expressions by Elaine Nichols.
Mhm.
And the quote says, Black joy affirms that I am not a victim. I am an agent of change. It reflects the idea, it rejects the idea that violence, injustice, discrimination, prejudice, and dominance over others are normal and acceptable actions. They are not.
That's right.
They are not.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that I that's embedded in all of this as well is the idea of accountability. So there's an organization called the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. And what they do is evaluate efforts to move organizations from words to action to accountability. What are those structures and strategies that are proven to achieve more equitable outcomes for Black people, Indigenous people, and communities of color? That's where the accountability lies.
That's right.
I'm not going to hold myself accountable for racist policies when I didn't create those racist policies, but I will certainly hold myself accountable for resisting those racist
Yes.
policies,
Mm.
Mhm.
Mhm.
right?
Of course. Yes.
So this, the idea of Black joy is still, let's see, Black joy affirms that I am not a victim. I am an agent of change. Yeah, this is the sentence you just read about. It rejects the idea that violence and injustice, discrimination are
Right.
normal and acceptable actions.
I
But
mean,
we've been talking earlier about resilience and avoiding the concept of Black folks being the victim. So I'm thinking that those are so close together. I don't know, Gail, you wanted to say something on that?
well, I think Black joy, I've always been just amazed and just honored that Black people have been able to maintain that. And they haven't lost, that means that you haven't lost yourself. When we can access joy, we access that deep connection to source, to God, whatever your belief system is, and we can access that joy because it's right there with love, right? And they haven't lost it, which is just amazing. Yeah.
As a community,
As a community,
as a
as a
culture.
as all the different levels, right? And it's very pure. And if you've ever been in a group with Black people and you can see that joy and feel that joy, it is just incredible. It is such a gift. You
It
know?
truly is.
Yeah.
It truly is.
Yeah.
It's
Mhm.
a way that I can be expressive about who I am in the depths of
Yes.
my own humanity,
Yes.
and not allow these forces out here to rob me of my humanity. You, white man, did not give me my humanity.
That's right.
And
That's
you don't have the right to abuse my humanity, though you have been doing that for years and
Right.
years, centuries and centuries. You don't have an inherent right to do that. Hence, there's resistance.
right. And the joy is the resistance, the joy is the resiliency. The joy is what you have within you always, right? Yeah, nobody's taking that
Good
from
way
you.
to say it, Gail.
You know?
Yeah. In other words, it's a joy that's by choice versus
Right.
you need to be resilient.
Right.
This is our joy. We are resilient already. You need to tell us that.
It's come from all the work that Black people have done, right?
And it's
For
like
generations.
the resilience and the joy are both just functions of who we
Right.
are.
Right.
of who we are.
Yeah.
So we don't need someone to tell us how to be
No.
resilient so that we can have joy. We don't need that.
Right. You
What
already
we
have it.
need and what we want is your accountability
Yes.
for the role that you play in all of this.
Yeah.
And continue if you're participating in that level.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we have only about 5 more minutes left. So I wanted to actually close with this Black joy quote, different from the one that I read earlier. Black joy is not dismissing or creating an alternative Black narrative that ignores the realities of our collective pain. Rather, it is about holding the pain and the injustice in tension with the joy that we experience. It's about using that joy as an entry into understanding the oppressive forces we navigate through as a means to imagine and create a world free of them. My joy is an expression of what it could be, look like, and feel like if racism did not exist. And I'm not going to allow someone to steal that joy from me. That's my whole entire thing about this whole, all the work that we've been doing with this podcast. Because remember, it all relates back to the Cairo question. Will Cairo, and Cairo is my 4-year-old grandson, have to fight in his lifetime for the birthright to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which he was born? I want him to have that right. I don't want him to simply be this Teflon person that stuff hits him and it just bounces off. I want him to have that sense of liberation, that sense of freedom, that I can walk down the street and I can just be the person that I am in the skin that I am in and have joy as a result of that. That's what this is about.
Wouldn't we want that for every child?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And the protection of their naivete, that they're, I was thinking of Cairo walking around at 1.5 or something in his little red shoes, pure joy, not concerned about who he was at all.
Exactly.
And then it gets taken away from us.
Absolutely. So we really got to quickly wind down. So this is the last one. The ultimate question is based on our collective personal accountability and how we each define ourselves as a member of this society, as a leader or as a learner. We all have that role to play. So the challenge is, what will you do, you personally do, in terms of your own personal accountability to ensure that Cairo and his contemporaries have the right to freely and peacefully exist in the skin in which they were born? So I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of Inflection Point Podcast right here on Transformation Talk Radio. We are here every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific time, 6 p.m. Eastern time, as we continue our community conversations. We have one more episode in this year, and that will close us out. So I look forward to 2025 and all the conversations that we will have then. So thank you for joining us, and we'll catch you the next time. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth,
reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.